Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rebecca Hurst. I'm the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston. The Sustainable Solutions Lab, or SISL, as we like to call it, is a research and action institute working to ensure that historically excluded people and communities are safe and healthy as our climate changes. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to reflect on the land and space that we occupy. While we are joining virtually, UMass Boston and many in our community live and work in what is known as the Greater Boston area in Massachusetts. These were and continue to be the traditional lands of Indigenous peoples, including the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag nations. I also want to recognize that a land acknowledgement like this isn't enough. It can serve as a part of ongoing efforts to recognize, honor, reconcile, partner with, and learn from Indigenous nations whose land and water we benefit from today. If you do not know whose land you're on, I encourage you to use resources such as Native Land Digital to find out. I'm really excited to be partnering tonight with Living on Earth to hear from Devi Lockwood about her new book, 1001 Voices on Climate Change. At the Sustainable Solutions Lab, we're always trying to listen and learn more about what people's experiences are to shape the direction we head in as we're thinking about programs, policies, and plans to address the climate crisis. Devi's book does just that. Through the voices of the people she spoke to, she paints a picture of how things are changing and pushes us to understand the urgency of acting on climate change now. Devi Lockwood has written about science, climate change, and technology for the New York Times, The Guardian, Slate, and The Washington Post, among others. She spent 5 years traveling in 20 countries on 6 continents to document 1001 stories on water and climate change, funded in part by the Gardner and Shaw Postgraduate Traveling Fellowships from Harvard and a National Geographic Early Career Grant. Lockwood graduated Phi Beta Kappa summa cum laude from Harvard, where she studied folklore and mythology and earned a language citation in Arabic. In 2019, she completed an MS in science writing at MIT. She is an editor for Rest of World and splits her time between New York and Vermont. So I'm so excited to be having this conversation, and we'll hand it over to Steve and Devi for this great talk today. Thank you all again so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, and welcome back, everyone, to the Living on Earth Book Club here. I'm Steve Curwood, host of the radio program and podcast Living on Earth, which is celebrating 30 years on the air. And tonight we are so thrilled to bring you a conversation with Devi Lockwood. As Rebecca mentioned, her new book is called 1001 Voices on Climate Change. And here it is, just in case you haven't noticed it in the poster. And this is her story distilled, really. Spoiler alert, they're not 1001 stories. You're going to be okay when you read this. You don't have to think about 1001. But of course, it's based on, well, maybe Devi will tell us the story of the woman who managed to survive that mean king many years ago by Scheherazade and what she was able to do. But anyway, Rebecca also mentioned that Devi traveled the world. I think you're often on a bike, right, Devi? To collect all these real and personal stories about how the climate emergency is affecting people and communities. Pick your suffering. There are floods, there are fires, there's droughts, there's rising seas. There is forced migration by these things. And I believe, well, in this book anyway, I see that you were in Sweden, China, the Canadian Arctic. You went to the Peruvian Amazon. You didn't make it to Antarctica, though, right? I guess that's probably not what you had in mind. But I think one of the things that's just so wonderful about this book is that you had this conviction. You write about it. You had this conviction that listening is an act of love, and that listening is a powerful antidote to this climate crisis. So I want you to tell us in a moment what inspired this quest for stories, and hear about some of the people that you met along the way. But I just have to remind those of you who are listening, watching tonight, that we can't do these free events without your help and support. And thanks to a generous offer from Tiller Press, the publisher of this book, this is an imprint of Simon & Schuster, we will send the first 18 people who donate $75 or more tonight a signed copy of the book. So, and if you want to submit a question to us, please use the Q&A feature on this Zoom webinar platform, or if you're on Facebook Live, just use the comment section for your question. So let's get started now, Devi. Devi Lockwood, welcome to Living on Earth.
Thank you so much for having me. Complete honor to be here. Yeah, so the backstory of these stories, should I start there?
Yeah, how did all this start? I mean, what got you, getting up and going and out to seek 1,001 stories about climate destruction?
Yeah, so in a weird way, some of it started with the Boston Marathon bombing. I was living in the city at the time as a student, and we were on lockdown for a couple of days, which felt like an eternity then. Now, in the time of a pandemic, it's not that big a deal. But the first thing that I wanted to do when it became possible to go back outside again was to just have conversations face to face with strangers and remind myself that not everybody is murderous. And so I had this kind of fit of inspiration. I found a box that had been used to ship broccoli in bulk to the cooperative house where I was living. And I cut that open and covered it with a paper bag and took out a Sharpie and wrote "open call for stories" on that sign, and then threaded a little polka dot ribbon around the edge of it so that I could hang it around my neck and have this cardboard as a conversation starter with strangers. And I just spent one afternoon wandering around the city for the day. And I heard all sorts of stories. People came up to me and told me everything from, there was a man who worked at the tea who was telling me that he wished just to have one last cup of coffee with his mother, and that brought her back from the brink of death. I was downtown and met a woman who also had a sandwich board sign on advertising parking, and she was dressed in a Lady Liberty costume. And she told me that she lost everyone on her block to an earthquake in Haiti and then had moved to Boston in the aftermath of that. And it just felt really incredible, this kind of spontaneous connection with strangers. And once I started doing that, I didn't really want to stop. And I had planned for myself a bike trip down the Mississippi River that summer, spent a month traveling about 800 miles, starting in Memphis, Tennessee, and ending in Venice, Louisiana, where the river meets the Gulf of Mexico. And I brought my little cardboard sign. And when I wasn't on the bike, I wore that sign around my neck, and all sorts of people talked to me about all sorts of things. But one common theme that emerged from a lot of those stories was about water and about climate change in terms of intensifying storms, saltwater encroachment on the land, people even south of New Orleans making decisions to leave communities that they had called home for, in some cases, generations in the aftermath of a big storm. And those stories were really sticky. It seemed like it was putting, names and faces and individual experiences to something that, I see climate change as one of the defining issues of my generation. And I thought it might be really powerful to put those stories from the lower Mississippi River Delta in dialogue with stories from other parts of the world. So I wrote a bunch of grant applications and got a bunch of no's and one yes, and that was all I needed to get started.
Of course.
And the idea for 1,001.
Well, let's stop.
Yeah,
let's stop and shout out to the funder. Let's shout out to the funder for a moment. Who helped you, if you're in a position to say?
Of
Sometimes
course,
those folks like to be anonymous.
No. It was through Harvard, the Gardner and Shaw postgraduate traveling fellowship. So the idea is for a year of purposeful wandering after graduation. And so I proposed to collect stories about water and climate change I thought it was only going to be a year at the outset. And then, 1 year kind of turned into 5.
So, you wrote that listening is an act of love. But what fascinates you so much with stories? Because there are many things you could listen to, per se.
Yeah. So I was a student of folklore and mythology. And for people who might not know, that's kind of the study of oral traditions from around the world and the ways that those stories that we tell about ourselves help us define our identity in real time, but also define a sense of place, define things like membership and belonging to a group. And I thought it would be really important to document the ways that we're talking about these environmental issues right now, not only to help us better understand the present, but also, frankly, for the future. I had some really transformative experiences in the archives as a student, and hope that this could be that for someone else down the line.
Okay, now wait a second, Debbie. You got to tell us about what helped transform you going through the archives there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, all sorts of things. There are a bunch of typewritten first drafts of Anne Sexton poems in the libraries at Harvard that, you know, you can see where she's crossed out lines, and that some of her first drafts weren't all that great either. They got better over time, right? And she's an incredible poet who I admire so much. So there was that, which was kind of the gateway to, I did a year of study at the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America. And through that, interacted really deeply with the work of this female poet from Vermont named Cora Brooks, who had done a bunch of anti-nuclear activism around the Vermont Yankee power plant. She was staunchly anti-war. She started a hotline for rural women who were experiencing domestic violence, where they could come stay with her or one of her friends when they needed it. And yeah, through those papers, I discovered that she was, in fact, still alive. Wrote her a letter, and we became great friends for the, 7 or 8 years I knew her until she passed away.
Cora Brooks was quite famous for what she did. I got to ask you about that title. Of course, I guess this is an allusion to Scheherazade, and most people probably know that story, but just remind us a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure. So this is a story that is very old and that was originally told orally, got written down, passed down over time, and there's been kind of small tweaks. But the version that I know goes a little something like this. So there was a king named Shahryar, and his wife cheated on him. And he, in a fit of rage, chopped off her head and decided that that wasn't enough, that he would have a vendetta against all women in the kingdom. So he would wed and bed them one by one and then chop off their head in the morning. And so it finally became Shahrazade's turn to have to go through this. And she is a trickster. So she decides that she is going to tell the king a story. And that story ends with a cliffhanger at dawn. And so he gets to dawn and he really doesn't want to kill her because he wants to know how the story ends. And then she does this night after night after night after night for 1,001 nights, at which point it's been 3 years. They have maybe a kid or two, and he decides that he's not going to kill all the women anymore. And what I found particularly moving about that series of interlocking tales is that Shahrazad tells these stories not only to save her own life, but to change the culture in her kingdom. And I thought it might be fun. It started out as a joke. I told my friend, I was like, what if I did 1,001 of these interviews? And she was like, yeah, why not? Go for it. And I was like, oh, okay. So yeah.
Well, you do the math. If you're traveling around and you talk to, say, 5 people at this cafe, this store, in the course of a day, and inside of a year, you could have 1,001 stories easily.
I thought it would be like that at the start. And then, there were kind of more twists and turns to the journey than I could have imagined.
Yeah. For example, well, take me on a tour of where you went and some of those twists and turns.
Yeah, sure. Well, I started out in the South Pacific. Part of the inspiration to go there was from an article I had read about the idea of climate refugees going from Tuvalu to other countries, primarily Fiji and New Zealand. And when I spoke with Tuvaluans, they don't like to be called climate refugees. Like, climate migration is a better kind of term for the people as they'd like to define themselves. But Tuvalu is this low-lying coral atoll nation about 585 miles south of the equator. And the kind of low-lying nature of this island nation makes it extremely vulnerable to sea level rise and changes in rainfall patterns and other impacts of climate change. And these are most intimately experienced through both food and water insecurity. So there used to be a freshwater lens under the island, and in the early 2000s, that became salty from changes in the level of the tides. And the seas have been rising at about 4 millimeters per year since they started monitoring it a couple decades ago. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but again, really dramatic impacts. When I was there, I asked one of the girls in the host family that I was staying with if she could take me out to see the wells that they used to have to drink water. And she's like, why would you want to see that? It's there's nothing there. But we went, and it's kind of been repurposed as a trash heap. And each family has a big rainwater tank that's attached to the roof. And when it rains, every drop is precious, right? So people are really good at conserving water and making do with what they have. But then in times of drought, that scarcity means that they have to make really difficult decisions about allocating it.
What drew you to Tuvalu? You start there. Why?
I didn't know where it was, frankly. And I had someone I knew at the time was taking a class about the politics of immigration when I was writing this grant proposal, and passed me an article about Tuvalu and migration in Tuvalu that was driven by climate change. And specifically, there's this thing called the Pacific Access Category Visa. It's like a lottery that Tuvaluans can enter to have permanent status in New Zealand. And there's a really large expat community of Tuvaluans living in and around Auckland. And those are primarily people who just don't see their future in this country because by some estimates, it's on track to become uninhabitable in the year 2050, which 2050 might sound like it's a long way away, but it's really not.
No, you'll still be giving to the Harvard Alumni Association. So, by the way, what did they tell you? Tell me a bit of the story of what they said of being in this so-called lottery, because there was a lot of litigation actually in New Zealand about climate migration, and there was a lot of pushback in New Zealand from some people who didn't want to do this, and then ultimately they came up in this system. But how do the Tuvaluans feel about this?
My sense is that it's kind of precarious, right? It's a certain amount of just being resigned to the fate of letting it happen. I'm still in touch with some people who I met there primarily through Facebook. And to my understanding, it's been on hold because of the pandemic. And so there's this, just kind of ongoing sense of anything could happen, but we have to do our best to prepare for the future that we have.
So, of course, if you go to Tuvalu, you have a chance to go to Fiji. You could go to New Zealand. How about Australia? And it's not too far from there to get to Thailand. And then maybe you're in Laos and Cambodia and China itself.
That's the path. Yeah.
That's the path. Yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously you didn't stop there because you go to the Americas, and you also, well, actually, no, you went to up to the stands as well, right? You went to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, Turkey. Let's see what else is on the list. It goes on. Peru, even, right?
Yeah.
So we mentioned at the beginning in the Amazon. So, what are the threads that you pull from these stories to make the fabric of how you would distill this experience? What are the fairly common threads? And then let's talk about a couple of outliers. And I know that we have to get into some of the folks that you met along the way. I'm thinking of in Kazakhstan, that boy that you talk about who who lost his brother in an accident near water.
Mm.
But first, tell me about what's common. What's common, and then kind of what starts to differentiate people dealing with this story of climate change. You say climate disruption is
Yeah.
really what we have, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about climate change is it's a global problem with very hyper local impacts, right? And so I met people who were mourning the loss of 5 of their best friends from a wildfire in Australia, right? Or a man in Thailand who made the choice to move from the rural north to Bangkok because changes in rainfall patterns had made the rice farming practice of his ancestors just not possible to rely on anymore for a livelihood. And the way that I have come to think about these themes over time, I mean, there's a couple of threads, right? One of
Okay.
them is that climate change drives food and water insecurity, and that forces people into really difficult scenarios. Another one is that climate change is an environmental justice issue. So the people who are first and worst impacted by these changes are more often than not already experiencing different forms of systemic and structural oppression that make it even more difficult for them to respond to those problems. And also, they're not the ones who have emitted the most greenhouse gases into the atmosphere to begin with, right? So they're the least responsible for it. And another thread, this is maybe a bit kind of the thread above the threads, but what I was trying to do in this book was to diversify the idea of expertise, because it's really important to me that we acknowledge at this point that people are experts in their own lived experience, and that form of expertise is as valid as what we might conventionally think about as a climate science expert who's, either has a PhD in atmospheric sciences or has spent time studying ice cores in Antarctica, right? Or monitoring permafrost melting in Sweden. All of these things are massively important. And there are some of those interviews in the book. But when we consider that science and that form of expertise side by side with the voices of people who are living with the impacts of climate change right now, I think it just becomes harder to ignore the problem, right? Humans are storytelling creatures. And storytelling it's one of the most ancient technologies that we have. And I have to believe that we can leverage that as a climate solution as well.
Well, indeed. I mean, storytelling is the way we transmit our culture. And I like to point out that writing is just simply a representation of the spoken word. And although we can see each other visually here, and folks in the who are watching now can also see each other, really at the end of the day, it is the voice. It is what we are able to say and hear from each other that really conveys things. The pictures are so very flat, and you can hear 360 degrees around you. And when you asked people to speak to you, you actually had two signs. You had tell me a story about climate and also tell me a story about water. Now, and you could flip it over one side to the other, I guess. Why those two?
Yeah. Well, climate change, I think I mentioned earlier when I was on that bike trip down the Mississippi River, it became apparent to me that we don't always have the words to talk about these impacts, but that by using stories, it can be a way in. But also, I think the language we use to talk about climate change a lot of times is really abstract and sometimes inaccessible. It can be hard to feel what a degree of temperature change is or a foot of sea level change. And so my hope was that putting stories to that would just make it easier to understand. And water, water is even easier to talk about, right? Everyone has a water story. Water is threaded throughout our lives. And many, not all, but many of the impacts of climate change are things that people experience through water, whether that's an overabundance of it in a flood, an acute lack of it in a drought, sea level rise. And so I wanted to give an inroad to being able to discuss these two issues in tandem.
You're so right about this, because the most prevalent greenhouse gas on the planet is water, right? Water vapor is by far the most abundant, and then of course CO2 is what we influence. And so I think that, and our bodies are mostly made of water. So when you got that story in Kyrgyzstan, did I pronounce that right?
It was actually, I was in Kazakhstan when I heard this story,
Oh,
but
Kazakhstan.
you
Okay.
did pronounce it right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell kind of how that story came about.
Yeah.
I was invited to Kazakhstan by the US Consulate General there. They were putting on a festival called Go Viral. I believe it was in 2017. And it was, I was invited to kind of talk about the story collecting work. And I traveled around for a little bit beforehand in both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan with a cardboard sign. And they were generous enough to furnish me with a translator and a driver and a videographer. They made a short film about it. It was a wholly different way of traveling than when I was just by myself on the bike. But I don't speak Russian or Kazakh, so it would have been really difficult without that. But yeah, I gave a presentation at this conference. And then on the last hour of the last day of the conference, right, people were packing down chairs. I was wearing this Tell Me Story About Water sign. And this man my age came up to me and he said, can I tell you my story? I'd really like to share it with you. And he was kind of visibly shaking. And I said, sure, do you want to do it in English or in a language you feel comfortable with? Like I can have someone translate for me. And he said, no, I really want to tell you in English because I think it's important that you understand. And so we found a quiet room and sat down. And he told me that he grew up in Afghanistan and had a brother who was a couple years younger than him, who he was in charge of looking after one afternoon. And the water piece of this story is that there wasn't access to potable water in the community where he lived. So each family would haul a bucket of water from the river inside and then boil it so that it was relatively safe for consumption. And he was watching his little brother one day, and somehow his brother got caught up in and around this boiling pot of water. The water came down on him, and his brother died from those burns. And it was so sad, And he told me that he'd never told anyone that story before. And he still feels responsible for his brother's death, but also that he's let this story shape him in that he's studying to become an engineer. And he doesn't want any kid to have to die because of lack of access to safe drinking water in Central Asia in the future. And I was just so moved by that for a couple of reasons. I mean, it's not on its face a climate change story, although we can extrapolate and say that climate change exacerbates a lack of access to safe drinking water in many places around the world. But the way that he's kind of decided to take action, right, to do something to make it better for other people is a spirit that I saw echoed in a lot of places too, in ways that people are addressing the environmental issues that they see in their communities head on.
I don't think it's an extrapolation at all. I mean, we live in an ecosystem. We live really in a hydrosphere in many respects. What is our body percentage of water? Like 70 something or another?
Something
Water,
like
the
that.
planet
Yeah.
is 70 something percent. The biggest greenhouse gas in the atmosphere, as I mentioned, is actually water vapor. And if we were to look for another planet for life on it, a wonderful signature would be hydrogen hooked up with some oxygen, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, climate, in my view, is not an abstract thing off to one side out of our whole ecosystem. And water is just, it is literally the lifeblood of our entire living systems that we have here. I'm trying to think real hard if there are any living creatures that don't need water. Maybe a coronavirus, but maybe even that needs water. I don't know. So if you um, as you look back, Devi, at your travels, um, and you mentioned that when you were in Central Asia, you found yourself, being escorted in fancy cars and all that. What was the best part of the traveling? You had a bike. You avoided airplanes as much as possible. You write about taking a freighter, I think, right?
Yeah, 2 cargo ships and 2 sailboats.
2 sailboats.
Yeah.
Which do you vote for, the cargo ship or the sailboat now in retrospect?
Oh, sailing was pretty great, but I learned, I mean, if there are sailors in the audience, they'll be like, oh yeah, duh, but I didn't know a lot about this when I started. There's a big difference between a monohull and a catamaran in
Oh
terms
yeah.
of the level of topsy-turviness that one feels. And so I was on a monohull at first and got quite seasick to the point where the crew that I was with, this was originally going to go between Australia, and the crew was going to let me off at Indonesia on their way to the Philippines, and they ended up telling me within the first couple of days, we don't know if we can take you any longer. Could you please get off? And so I jumped ship and went on a catamaran, which was a whole lot more stable. I don't know. It's so beautiful to be in the ocean like that. I mean, talk about Earth being a water planet. Whenever I did travel on the water, I felt that in a really embodied way, whether it was seeing dolphins surfing under the bow wave, or phosphorescence, or just the salt. But I don't know, if I were to pick one moment, I traveled up and over Arthur's Pass in New Zealand, which the road going up there, I was on my bike, and the road going up there is one of the steepest in the country. And I also managed to run out of food, as one does, on the way up this road. And so I was pretty hungry. I pulled over at the only place to stop, which was a gas station, went inside, and the only thing that looked palatable were like gummies, but they didn't have gummy bears or gummy worms. They only had gummy vampire teeth. And so I bought my bag of gummy vampire teeth, and sat outside next to my bike and proceeded to eat the entire bag very quickly because I was ravenous. And there were 2 attendants at the station who were out there, smoking and kind of laughing at me. And they were like, if you get tired, just roll back down on your bike and we'll pick you up in the ute, which is what they call a truck, and drive you to the top. And I'm like, that was the fire in my belly that I needed to get me to the top. And so, which was, I mean, they were being really nice. But yeah, pedaled the rest of the way up there, past this viaduct, and people were rolling down their windows to cheer me on. And I was so elated when I got to the top of this mountain pass that I jumped off my bike and picked a flower from the side of the road, and then did a little happy dance, even though no one was around. And that became a ritual that I tried to adopt at the top of any tall hill that I thought maybe I might not make it up, that I would take the time to express joy. So that was a high moment for sure, just of bike travel, which is such a magical way of getting around and meeting people, frankly.
And breathing the air and making Debbie's own personal story from this.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a version of this book that I pitched years before the eventual acceptance of this book that didn't have much of me in it at all, because I felt hesitant to include too much of myself. I thought that it would be taking away from the magnitude of the stories that I'd heard. But some of the feedback that I got was that, what's going to keep someone turning the pages? The book doesn't have a narrative beyond what's inside each individual story. And I realized that I was the narrative sinew, and I'd have to put myself out there a little bit more. And it was a little uncomfortable to find that balance, but I think I left with something that I feel good about.
So another way to get at this is, what was the impact on you emotionally in this process of traveling and gathering these stories?
I can say confidently that I've become a much better listener. I listened back to some of those early interviews, actually kind of right after I did them, in the months after I did them, because it became my senior thesis for college, right? And with those storytellers down the Mississippi River, I was kind of pushy. I was asking a lot of questions, and I wasn't always listening fully. I was thinking about whatever it was that I was going to say next. And yeah, I realized that I needed to take a couple steps back and become more comfortable with silence, because sometimes that's just people thinking, and developed this kind of ethic of deep listening that I tried to carry with me in every interview, where it's, sitting down with someone and being completely present and believing fundamentally that everyone has something to teach me, and just showing up for that, and no distractions, leaning forward a little bit, nodding, making space. And I don't know, there were just so many times where people would thank me afterwards and say that it felt really good to talk about these issues, or they thanked me for even just creating a space to talk about environmental issues in their community, right? And I don't know, that always felt good. So that's one way I can say I changed.
So I have to ask you this,
Sure.
and nobody's listening or watching except for, just a few hundred people here. What was the most unexpected interview that you got?
Oh, well, there was a family that outran a tsunami in Sri Lanka. I wasn't expecting to hear that. It was a South African family I met when I was riding my bicycle up the east coast of Australia. And there's this really wonderful website called Warm Showers, which is kind of like couch surfing, but for people who ride their bikes. And so this was a family of road cyclists, and they were really eager to host me because I was their first guest. And yeah, so I rode my bike to stay with them. I think the mom trades stocks or options for the US stock market. So she was like trying to teach me about all this finance stuff. And then on the last day, they sat me down to tell me a story, which was that they were in Sri Lanka on holiday in that year in the early 2000s when the tsunami happened. And their kids were quite young then. And they were out on the beach, and all the water just receded. And by the time they realized what was happening, the mom took the two kids and was running up the hill in one direction. The dad was running in another direction, and he got caught like in and around some buildings and almost didn't make it out alive, but then he did. And the mom and kids weren't reunited with him until several hours later at a monastery. But just the intensity of that, and again, a tsunami is not directly related to climate change, right? That's an earthquake under the ocean that's displacing water, but it does display the power of water, because it really marked a before and after point for this family, right? They witnessed so much destruction, and they weren't the same after that. They became a lot closer knit, I think it's fair to say, but also had a value for like life and togetherness in a way. And water has that power at its most intense.
And just as a personal aside, Debbie, I've been very curious about all the melting of ice around the planet, and the fact that the oceans now have more water, and water weighs a lot, as you know from your biking.
Mm-hmm.
And what influence has this had on the tectonic plates? Is there a connection, in fact, to earthquakes and volcanic activity? I keep asking that question. There's a single scientist in the UK who has been saying, well, maybe there's something happening here. Most scientists say, oh, don't be silly.
Yeah, that's a great
But,
question. I mean, I'm not an earth scientist, so I don't know, but I think it's a question that's worth asking. Yeah.
yeah, because this climate it's the envelope in which we live.
Mm.
And as you point out, when we talk about climate change, it sounds rather clinical and scientific in a way, but it is the change in how the ecosystem works in a fundamental way,
Mm.
based on being a water planet that's not dominated by carbon. Because if they're dominated by carbon, of course, it'd be Venus, right? And and the last bit of atmosphere that seems to be on Mars has more CO2 than just the nitrogen and such. So this is we're part of a system, and you getting around to talk to everybody is really been just wonderful. Now, one of your stories, you go right into the heart of the climate bureaucracy debate, the talks there in Marrakesh in 2016. Tell me about that. What was the mood like there? Tell me about who you met.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting hearing about the climate conference that just wrapped up, because I think a lot of the issues that I encountered when I was at COP22 in 2016 in Marrakesh, Morocco, are the same things that are happening now. So it's an ongoing, really interesting space. So the Conference of the Parties happens each year. In 2016, it was a unique year to be there representing US youth in a civil society space, because on one of the first days of the conference, the US elections happened. And so had, youth delegates from Brazil coming up to us and being like, are you the Americans? Do you need a hug? This is going to be hard. And so that was interesting. I think another, kind of disparity that was so stark was just seeing visually the people who were in the civil society zones of the conference, right? We don't have decision-making power. We're there because trying to advocate for something or listen to something, right? But don't have that kind of access to the negotiations, of course. And there are folks who are younger, a lot of indigenous people from around the world, ton of people of color. And then the negotiators themselves it's just like a lot of white guys in suits, a lot. And so it becomes kind of stark realizing who's making the decision. Again, they're a lot older too than the people who are on the outside trying to push for their voices to be heard. But one of the really incredible people who I met while I was there is Gertrude Kenyagi, and she is a Ugandan forestry activist. And she comes from a community in southwestern Uganda where small scale agriculture is the kind of main economic activity. And she told me about the way that kind of organic agriculture by default has helped them maintain a steady supply of everything from bananas to kidney beans to peas. But she was at the Conference of the Parties to advocate for gender equality in climate policies and solutions, because she told me that the people who are the most impacted by climate change are those who are not able to adapt, and they can't absorb the shock. And so it's just almost impossible for people to bounce back from any climate disaster. And she added that women in particular are very vulnerable. And so in Uganda, climate change is impacting agriculture, and she's seeing this, whether it's prolonged droughts or violent rains or landslides even that can be deadly. And she's continued when possible to travel to COP to just advocate for how important considering women in agriculture in Uganda is in these types of negotiations.
Well, this part of your set of stories has a wonderful set of lines. I wonder if you wouldn't mind turning to page 207, I think it is.
Okay, sure.
And read the last two paragraphs of Gertrude's story.
Yeah, sure.
To us, if you could. Or maybe actually, I'm sorry. I want 3 paragraphs.
All right. Many policies end up on the shelf. She also hoped that the powerful nations of the world would stop being selfish and would adopt methods that are more sustainable and transformative, not just for the sake of least developed countries, but for themselves as well, she said. We are all in this together. When you think about Uganda specifically, what does climate change there smell like or sound like or taste like? I asked. It tastes like a shortage of food. It tastes like shortage of water because our agriculture is rain-fed and we are dependent on natural sources of water, she told me. So when the aquifers dry up and our crops fail, it smells like disaster. It's so evident that climate change is taking place. The seasons have shifted. When we expect rain, it doesn't come. And when it comes, it's too short a duration. You cannot plant anything. So we don't have any fallback position. We don't have reserves of food. We don't have money stashed in the bank. We live day by day.
So what prompted you to start asking this question of what does climate change smell and taste like to people? When did that emerge in the process? That you would get some pretty powerful answers if you ask people that way.
Yeah, I think I was just trying to get sensory. I was thinking about what makes a good story and the elements of good storytelling. And sometimes, especially in these like UN negotiating spaces, we can speak at a really high level about, overly intellectualizing it just because that's the ocean, the water that we're swimming in, the language that we're surrounded by, right? But in fact, breaking it down to senses and to things that we can taste and smell and feel makes it feel all the more immediate. And yeah, it felt like an important question to ask in that moment, and in a couple of other moments as well.
Let me ask you, what does climate change smell and taste like now that you've been
To
through this
me,
odyssey? To you,
personally,
yeah.
ooh, well, I'm living in Vermont right now. And there's a certain smell, I think, when the snow comes. And it's almost this like dry and wet at the same time, cold. But I know that from listening to the news here, and from just reading that there's changes in how winter happens here over time. And so it's a change in that feel, right? It's warmer, wetter winters that, for me, one of the most dramatic impacts that I've even felt in my lifetime, mostly living in New England, is that there's way more Lyme disease carrying ticks than there used to be. And everyone in my family has had Lyme's at one point. It's a really terrible thing. Would not wish it on anyone. And, when I was a kid, I didn't think twice about romping through the woods or, immersing myself in a pile of leaves or something like that. And now all of those activities become fraught with this added danger because when the winters are not as intense, then the ticks are able to kind of thrive longer. And also, I think it has to do as well with the removal of apex predators over time, but that's a longer than just my lifetime kind of time scale. But for the deer that carry the ticks. And so everything, as you mentioned earlier, is so beautifully and complicatedly interconnected on this planet. And so I think one of the fun things and strange things about asking about climate change is just realizing that interconnection. And I felt that, this summer, even with the wildfires out west, we had that smoke here. And there were air quality warnings in New England, right? So it's impossible to be distant from these impacts. They're here and they're now.
So, how did it work, Devi, when you were traveling in these places where you needed a translator?
Yeah.
And the sub question of that is, to what extent was asking the water question really much more helpful in those settings where I'm not sure how you translate climate change in the way that we use the word climate change? We industry didn't like global warming, so they said, look, we should call it climate change, and media and everybody seemed to go along with that.
Mm-hmm.
So let me restate the question. How did this work when you had to ask people about things in translation?
Yeah, so it worked differently in different places. I'll give you a couple of examples. When I got to Thailand, I connected with a friend who worked for a TV station in Bangkok. And she was generous enough to help me translate not only both sides of the cardboard sign into Thai, but also a couple of paragraphs that I wrote out about who I was and what I was doing and why I was collecting these stories in the first place. But also she kind of helped me anticipate the problem that not everyone was going to be literate. And so using Google Translate's voice to or text to voice was able to kind of roughly communicate to people what I was saying. This meant that there were some situations where I was recording a story that was being told to me in a language that I didn't know what it said. And so I gave a talk at a high school in New Hampshire a couple of years ago and mentioned this because someone asked the same question in the audience. And there happened to be a Thai exchange student who very generously offered to make a summer internship out of translating these stories from me. And I had a similar situation with the stories I was documenting in the Lao language. And he had a friend who spoke Lao who helped me kind of transcribe and translate those audio recordings. Which it was like kind of opening an Easter egg years later. And then in China, when I was there, I hired a recent graduate from an English college to help me kind of translate and approach people as well. In Turkey, one of my good friends from high school, her sister helped me translate. And yeah, it was a fun kind of chaotic patchwork. And also I made use of the website Fiverr, which is a great resource for translations. Again, a couple of years down the line when I was back and trying to decipher some of these interviews.
So let me see how we're doing. Oh, we're getting towards the end of things here. So
Yeah.
let's hear one more story.
Okay.
During your journey, you spent a fair amount of time in Australia. And you heard Jack and Corna's really kind of biblical story about water.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about what readers would find on page 115 in your book. Who are they, and how did they end up in what they called quite happily the Noah's Ark situation? My goodness, the Boston accent came out there. Noah's Ark situation.
Yeah, so Jack is a musician who at the time that I met him was working with his wife Corna at a wildlife rescue and rehabilitation center in Australia. And the story that they told me was about a flood in 2013 in which they rescued 17 animals that they had been looking after. So there was a creek nearby them that rose 10 meters and came through the house and the sheds, and the hills all funneled water into the valley where they were. And so they rescued quails and sugar gliders, possums, wallabies, kangaroos, birds, and even a snake, and kind of got all of these creatures into a car and brought food for the animals, but not a lot for themselves, and just drove to higher ground. And they ended up spending the night in the car with 18 animals. The snake was a spotted python. They didn't have any cell service. And the next day, emergency services arrived with a boat and they asked if they needed help. And at first, Jack and Corner were like, no, we're fine. We've got enough food and water. We're not in danger. So those first responders continued upstream. But then they came back a couple hours later and they're like, no, you really need to come with us. we are going to rescue you. And Jack said, well, we've got all these animals with us. And they're like, no, you have to leave the animals and just bring yourselves. And they're like, well, then we're not going to go anywhere. Right. And so eventually they did some negotiations and agreed that they could take the animals. Jack said it was like talking to the United Nations about world peace or something. And they were able to take all the animals except for the snake. And so they kind of left the snake on the high ground and then got all the little animals in the rescue boat. And he said it looked like Noah's Ark. And many of these were just like, tiny baby creatures. And so everyone on board the boat grabbed a pouch with a little baby in it. And everyone survived. All the animals survived except for the quails, which he joked that they might have passed away because they spent a night in a car with a snake in the backseat. And it was a month and a half before they were able to return back to their home, and they lost a lot in terms of kind of tangible things like cars and tractors, but for them the animal life was the most important.
So we haven't talked much about the deep emotional impact of all of this. And frankly, you mentioned the boy who had lost his little brother,
Mhm.
trying to get water, an accident there. But uh, in many cases, this must have been cathartic for people, right? To actually tell you something, maybe even come to realizations themselves as to how the climate emergency was proceeding in their lives. We have a few more moments. Can maybe this? What comes to mind to me is there was among your narratives, there's a woman who was brought up in Florida who talked to you about
Yeah, yeah. We met at a climate march in DC, and she told me about diving in the coral reef in the Florida Keys when she was a kid, and just being wowed by the colors and the vibrancy of life there. And she hadn't been there for a couple decades and then returned as an adult, and the majority of that coral was bleached and dead. And and she just started sobbing, right? It was so clear how much of a sense of loss she felt. um and yeah, it was an instance where I think it's important to kind of talk about these things. They're hard to talk about. It's a lot easier to be silent about climate change, right? Um, but there's a word for that kind of experiencing that deep kind of loss, and it's solastalgia, right? And so I think that there's ways that we have to cope with, just like you mentioned, the emotional aspect of these changes, right? They're easy to ignore, but I think it's, like many things, just so much better when we talk about it.
Yeah, I have to confess I brought that up because I had a similar experience when I was a college student many years ago at Harvard. I spent some time in the Virgin Islands and diving and such. And a few years ago, I went to Barbados, not to the Virgin Islands, but Barbados, where there's a tourist submarine.
Hmm.
And I was so excited to take my wife down in the sub and show her the reefs because not everybody dives, but the tourist subs do pretty well. They go to like 90 feet. You can see a lot. And the only thing that was really of interest to the guides was this hulk of a ship. There were a few things swimming around it. There were just a few corals flapping there, but the fish were gone. Almost all of the coral was gone from this biome. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks that this is no joke. This is simply no joke. And so, who needs to hear these stories, Devi? Who needs to, how can this catalyze real and meaningful action by people? You know, I'm a journalist. I have that experience. Okay, I keep working on climate disruption. But what about the rest of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really easy to be paralyzed. I wrote this book for people who might feel like, okay, I know climate change is happening, but I don't want to have anything to do with it, right? So my hope is that it's just a way to access the issue in a way that feels more accessible for all of us, frankly. And I don't know, if someone who's like a decision maker or in power reads this, my hope is that their takeaway would be that we need to diversify the kinds of expertise that we have in the room, in all kinds of rooms of power, right? Because if we're moving towards solutions but not taking into account the voices and lives of people who are most impacted right now, it's kind of dangerous and ineffective.
That's how we got there, right?
Yeah. Totally. Yeah.
All 400 gigatons of CO2 that carbon that the United States put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In
Yeah,
other words,
oof.
and the atmosphere only has 800 gigatons of carbon. Now, granted, much of that carbon's been reabsorbed, what we did, but CO2 lasts for hundreds of years. So perhaps there's a chance to for us to change as a species before we don't have the ability to change. I guess, oops, I guess we got to wrap up here. I'm just looking to see if there's anything quick from our audience that I didn't get to ask. There are a few questions that I was able to put into this. Mostly people are saying how wonderful you are and
Well,
how much
that's
they
nice.
appreciate your work.
Yeah,
And
I mean, thank you.
well, it's beautiful. So again, let me just say that Devi Lockwood is author of the book 1001 Voices on Climate Change. There it is. Okay. And a big thank you to our co-sponsors, the Sustainable Solutions Laboratory at UMass Boston, the UMass Boston School for the Environment, and also the UMB McCormick Graduate School. And thank all of you for joining us, because if you don't come and participate, then we ain't got nothing. So if you did enjoy this free event, please consider supporting what we do here at Living on Earth by donating on our website. It's loe.org. And we are a listener-supported show, and your contribution will make an impact, whether you send us $5 or $500 or $5,000, because we really do appreciate your help. And as a reminder, don't forget our special thank you for tonight, because the first 18 folks who pitch in $75 or more, we will send you a signed copy of 1001 Voices on Climate Change. And also be sure to sign up for our newsletter at loe.org to find out about all the other free events we'll be having in the coming months. And coming up soon, we will take a look at the Underwater Wild by the octopus teacher, Craig Foster. That'll be coming up on December 9th. So don't miss that, and there's more information on that. So Devi, again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Really a joy to be in conversation with you all tonight. Thank you so much.
And I appreciate you demonstrating again how helpful it is to have this art of listening.
Yeah, you're good at it. Don't worry.
Oh, well, don't tell anybody. The secret to listening to people in interviews is you listen and you don't take notes. And you have wonderful producers who have prepared notes for you and who have suggested questions, so you don't even have to think about what your next question might be. You just listen, and then if it's time for another question that hasn't come immediately out of the talk, you look and you see something even smarter than you could ever think of that your producer has for you. So
well, big thanks to
is,
the production team too.
Yeah,
They're great.
listening is a collective effort. You have speakers and you have listeners, and it all works to bring us. But I'm going to remember your line that listening is an act of love.
Good.
Anyway, thank you all. Thanks for joining us, and good night.